Sir Arthur Cotton biography by his daughter, Lady Elizabeth Hope. Yesterday I read till page 49. So now we'll begin at page 50. Okay, let's begin. Let's see how is the life. Visual coming. We'll begin at page 50. Page 50, chapter 4, biography of Sir Arthur Cotton by his daughter Lady Elizabeth Hope. Okay. Chapter 4, the beginnings of great duties. Quote, the nature of the irrigation works in the Madras Presidency and their historic development are best illustrated in the great Kaveri scheme, which supplies a delta stretching from above the town of Trichinopoli to the sea. The chief systems of southern India are all on the eastern coast, all deltaic, all modern adaptations of ancient designs, and all make river waters available by the same class of works. Any of them will serve as a key to the rest, and this particular scheme, as the largest and most profitable, is naturally selected to indicate the type. End of quote. Honorable A. Deakin, MLA. What's this? MLA. Was he a member of Legislative Assembly? Okay. Captain Cotton's beginnings in southern India as a semi-independent officer with scope to exercise his sorry, Cap- Captain Cotton's beginnings in southern India as a semi-independent officer with scope to exercise his growing faculties synchronized with that period in Great Britain and elsewhere of eager hope as to what the application of science would do towards increasing the productivity of the earth and the happiness of the various races of mankind. In England, this period was, in a measure, inaugurated by the publications of the famous Bridgewater treatises. The effort of the human mind, which they represented, finds expression in the phrase then so widely current. He who makes, quote, he who makes two blades of grace to grow, quote, he who makes two blades of grass to grow where one grew before is a benefactor of his race. There is a passionate desire in men to see some tangible result of their labor, especially if that labor be of its strenuous character. The test is always applied to an enterprise, material or moral. Does it pay? And if not carried too far, the test is not an unworthy one. My father, in 1836, stands at the threshold of the most distinguished part of a great career. Looking, as we are able to do, from the end to the beginning, it is possible to say of his notable achievements that they have been altogether good. Their effects were and are beneficial only. a builder of empire, of that particular empire of Britain, of which he was one of the most admiring of sons, and which he regarded as guarded by and blessed of God. There is no record of human suffering in all he accomplished. The stones which go to make his niche of famous, sorry, the stones which go to make his niche of fame are nowhere cemented by human anguish or the shedding of blood. Why there was no shedding of blood? Earlier Britons shed the blood for him. What the hell? All he did has been of a character to make life more prosperous to many millions and to satisfy abundantly the most elementary needs of human life. This done, all else was possible. Continually hungry and poverty-stricken people can make no progress. Such a tribute as this, when Arthur Cotton's most important achievements are first taken in hand by him, is due to him. It was in a spirit which was ever mindful of the gain which would result to humanity that he undertook and carried with so strenuous a determination his great projects to success. Not a little of his success was due to his intense zeal and powers of hard work. Only such a noble ambition as he cherished could have carried him through what he did, not simply in traveling through the districts in all seasons, but also in the preparation of elaborate reports for the consideration of the government. No detail was too sorry, no detail was too unimportant for his personal consideration, no toil too severe for him to endure. What did Arthur Cotton do in Tanjore? He devised a great scheme for controlling the river Kaveri and saving its almost priceless water from running to waste. To grapple with the Kaveri's current was no mean achievement. Colonel Caldwell, the first British engineer to examine the river with care, which he did in 1804, was forcibly struck with the unusual character of the Kaveri. He predicted its total annihilation as a useful stream at no distant future unless the river could be restored to what he believed to have been its original condition. My father's comment on this statement was as follows. Quote, but the evil, though progressive, is much slower than might at first be expected. The sand and heavier ingredients are deposited in the bed of the river, but a considerable portion of the firm soil from its less specific gravity remains longer in suspension and is ultimately carried into the smaller channels and from them into the rice fields, which it greatly enriches. End of quote. It is clear this engineer was not afraid of the vagaries of the stream. Quote, the original merit of conceiving the plan of so grappling with a great river like the Kaveri as to compel it to become an easily controlled agent cannot be impaired, and I may be permitted to express my admiration of the skill and courage they display both in their design and execution. End of quote. Thus said Colonel Bate Smith 17 years after Captain Cotton's work had been begun. He further remarked, quote, the permanent prosperity of Tanjore is, without doubt, to be attributed in large measure to that first bold step taken by Colonel Cotton in the construction of the Upper Coleraine Dam under circumstances of great difficulty with restricted means, against much opposition, and with heavy personal responsibilities. End of quote. There was no prosperity when Captain Cotton conceived his plan. On the contrary, the district was in a state of decay the people spiritless and suffering. This testimony was the common opinion of everyone capable of judging as to what was done. The official in charge of the district at the time, Mr. W. N. Kindersley, who is described by Sir Alexander Arbuthnot as, quote, one of the ablest civil servants in the Madras presidency, end of quote, declared that there was, quote, not an individual in the province who did not consider the upper Anicut the greatest blessing that had ever been conferred upon it. End of quote. Mr. Kindersley also expressed his conviction that, quote, the name of its projector would, in Tanjore, survive those of all the Europeans who had ever been connected with it. End of quote. That was civilian testimony. What would a brother engineer say of the project? Brother engineers were not wanting in the expression of their opinions. They shared the view of Captain Cotton's superior, the chief engineer of the presidency, Colonel Duncan Sim, afterwards commanding engineer throughout the siege of Delhi, who was deputed to report upon the conception and progress of the work. Colonel Sim's praise was unstinted. Quote, simple and natural as this course, that is the project of the Anicuts, may now appear, no one previously to Captain Cotton thought of recommending it, and it was attended by a degree of responsibility and risk which few would voluntarily have undertaken. For the talent and judgment displayed by Captain Cotton in his patient investigation of the causes which were affecting the rivers in Tanjore, and for the boldness with which he proposed and carried into effect what appeared to be the only remedy, I conceive that officer is entitled to the highest praise. End of quote. The same fine characteristic was exhibited by my father in the Godavari works and received like commendation. Colonel Sim, contemplating the unfinished work near Dhauleshwaram and understanding all that was involved in it, turning to Major Fred Cotton, exclaimed, quote, I am astonished at your brother's professional daring. End of quote. More than 40 years later, similar credit from similar authority was given to the engineer. 40 years are a long period in a man's life, time enough to be forgotten twice over. But Arthur Cotton was not forgotten, and in 1882, the High Tribute of 1839 was virtually repeated in the report of the Chief Engineer for Irrigation in that year, when he remarked that to Captain, now Sir Arthur Cotton, is due the entire credit of the series of works which have fulfilled the purposes for which they were designed with such remarkable success. End of quote. Colonel Duncan Sim's reading of Captain Cotton's characteristics bears a moment's consideration. With unerring discernment, he brings to light what really were the guiding principles of the daring engineer's character. Originality of thought. Quote, no one previously to Captain Cotton thought of recommending, end of quote, the simple and natural course he adopted. Courage in the carrying out of his convictions. Quote, attended by a degree of responsibility and risk which few would voluntarily have undertaken. End of quote. Originality and courage Added to these was loyalty and conviction. If my father lived for any one thing more than another, it was that he might press forward the use of water for navigation and irrigation. At a discussion in 1877, following a paper read by him at the East India Association, one of the speakers said, if Sir Arthur Cotton would open his mind to the great value of railways at the same time that he urges the real importance of canals, his views would undoubtedly commend themselves more cogently to many people acquainted with India and the points at issue, and the aim for which he so laboriously and conscientiously worked for many years would be more speedily advanced. The response to this was instantaneous and in high indignation. That is, retorted the rightly annoyed engineer, if I would either be a party to what I know is false or would help to conceal the truth as to the very essential and fundamental point of the whole matter, it would be the way to promote the truth. Sir Arthur's friends will not need that any emphasis should be given to the haughty pride with which this assertion of fidelity to principle was made. Oh goodness. This book is actually not a biography, but a polemical tract. It will be seen that, unlike many men, Arthur Cotton had not to wait for many years until the joy of seeing difficulties overcome had become mitigated by a want of recognition. Though he never sought for praise, it is clear the recognition which his work extorted was gratifying to him. It could not well be otherwise. But praise never spoiled him, never developed conceit, never led to self assertion. On the contrary, he modestly accepted what was said of that which he had done and found in it an incentive to do something immediately after, even more worthy of regard, even more useful in increasing the comfort and happiness of his fellows. From his earliest to his latest day, this was a marked characteristic of his every act. What then really was the work so highly praised for its conception and execution, and the financial results of which, as an investment of public money, were so marvelous and so gratifying? It was one which, as has already been stated, was destined to stamp Captain Cotton as an engineer of preeminent gifts in hydraulic works, which, of all engineering works, are the most difficult to plan and to execute with complete success. The stability of bridges, for example, can be determined with mathematical accuracy, and they may be designed so as to be nearly independent of the action of water. But a system of dams and channels is no sooner established than the most watchful care is needed to preserve it in efficiency, and any mistakes or oversight in the original design are sure to make themselves manifest and to require unforeseen and often very difficult remedies. Hence, discernment and foresight of a high order are essential in such designs. Captain Cotton's ascendancy in the possession of such qualifications was such that seemed unquestionable to those who were best acquainted with its engineering feats. A note here, writing of the Sirhind Canal, Mr. Diakin, in his book Irrigated India, pages 214 and page 224, says, every mile of the canal proves full of instruction as well as entertainment. Like a living organism, The great stream of water continually alters its environment and is altered by it in time, so that the engineer's task is never over. He constantly meets new contingencies and by the lessons of experience on his own or upon other canals learns to vary his expedients out of those far off mountains, and by this thirsty spectre land come the thin streams of water which are now filtered into the canal to carry its boon of harvests for scores of miles into country almost as unprofitable as this. But in a few months there will be no longer this empty valley and this quietness of air through which the voices of the changras on the weir make a faint murmur. That great reef will then be hid in foam when the flood tide, spreading from bank to bank and hoarsely roaring, will sweep down 12 feet to 16 feet deep, half a mile wide, shifting its quicksands and shingle beds from side to side as a porter shifts his load, tossing its tangle of trees, grinding its rank of boulders against the stubborn mass of stone and iron that will bar its way. In the heat and in the storm, the engineers will stand to their posts and flinch from no contest with flood, fever, or famine, or with the river which they master, as their government masters this people, to prevent the ruin which must certainly follow if its great subject forces should ever master them. Oh, quite a colonial argument using the metaphor of the rivers, canals, and its engineers. Did this lady know what she was actually quoting? Before answering the question with which the preceding paragraph is opened, let this example of how the test will it pay borne by Sir Alexander Arbuthnot be recorded. Sir Alexander says, the financial returns of these works have been such as have seldom resulted from any public undertaking. From the report above quoted, it appears that for 6 years after the construction of the aqueducts, the annual profit on the capital expended was, in the case of the upper aqueduct, 69%, and in that of the lower aqueduct, nearly 100%. The increased value of private property due to the works has been equally large, while in seasons of scarcity, not only have these districts been preserved from the horrors of famine, but they have been enabled to pour large supplies of food into the adjoining districts. My father shall be his own exponent as to what he wished exactly to do with what he had seen. In considering how this noble river may be improved to the utmost, he wrote, it immediately occurs that our grand object must be not to let its waters run to waste into the sea. In high freshes, an immense quantity is lost because it comes down faster than it can be applied to use. In low freshes, a smaller but still very large quantity is lost at the very time that it is most required because it is on too low a level for the lands to be irrigated by it. In the first case, our object is to gain time, in the second, to gain height. But it is to the second point, namely the saving of water in low freshes, that I wish particularly to call the attention of government for the reasons already stated. The two plans usually adopted for raising the water from the bed of the river to a sufficient level to answer the purposes of irrigation are, first, by carrying a portion of the stream through a channel having a less fall than the surface of the country till it has attained a level above that of the adjoining land, and second, by damming up the river. The first of these is preferable under certain circumstances, but it is very rarely indeed that the cost of diverting the water in a river can be secured in this way, for generally the cutting at the head of the channel must be so deep and the channel must be of such great length to gain the required elevation that it would be too expensive. Of the scheme he recommended for approval, he remarks, the present cultivation of Tanjore would be entirely secured except in extraordinarily bad years. Not only would crops be saved that are now lost entirely, but by far the greater part of the whole district would be made to produce larger crops. In extraordinarily deficient years, the amount saved by the dam would be far greater than in ordinary years. When lecturing at the School of Military Engineering at Chatham many years after, he said the history of this work would give an idea of the state of things under the company's government. In 1827, he observes, I was sent to inspect it, as the people were stated to be nearly in a state of rebellion from its neglect. I found the works in utter disrepair. The Coleraine Canal had 6 feet of silt in its bed, so that when it ought to have had 8 feet of water flowing down it, it had two. Thus, this work, which had a population of perhaps 100,000 and a revenue of 40,000 pounds dependent upon it, had not been allowed 500 pounds to keep it in repair. The government could not afford it. Is it surprising the natives thought us savages? I made a small estimate of 3,500 pounds for some immediate repairs, but knowing what its fate would be, I proceeded to Madras and arrived just in time to hear, as I expected, that the government could not squander such sums as this upon the wild demands of an engineer. We had, however, a governor at that time who was accessible, and I asked the chief engineer to go to him and speak to him about it. He said the papers had never been laid before him and ordered the expenditure. In my ignorance at that time, I thought the point was gained, as orders were sent to the collector of the district, who had first called for my report on the case, and whose business it was, according to the absurd arrangement of that time, to execute the work. Soon after, I left the district and did not return till 1833, when, to my astonishment, I found that the collector had not taken the trouble to spend the money or the government to enforce it. A small sum only had been spent, and the people were in such a state of rebellion that it had been feared troops would have to be sent into the district. Such was the inconceivable state of things under that admirable middle class government. Oh, we should admire Sir Arthur Cotton. He had the guts to oppose his government, criticize that government, keep on haranguing against that government. And actually, we have to be slightly suspicious and skeptical also, because this was something he was speaking in the second half of the 18th century, while the affairs he relates have happened in the first half. And by that time, he had been disappointed in his hopes of huge navigational canal system throughout India. So probably it was Ranker speaking. The Kaveri is a large river rising in the range of mountains known as the Western Ghats, which, catching the strength of the southwest monsoon, fills all the rivers, draining their slopes with very large volumes of water. It is the biggest of the rivers in the south of the peninsula and runs for some hundreds of miles before reaching the head of the delta, at which point it throws off its first effluent, called the Coleraine. Here it should be remarked what Arthur Cotton himself frequently stated. He was not dealing with a virgin river or with virgin soil. Indian rivers were turned to irrigating purposes centuries before the British obtained a footing on the continent. Indian rulers of ancient times vied with each other in the execution of works which in a great degree proved of exceeding benefit to the country. The practice of irrigation in India and in China antedates the historical epoch by an indeterminate period. The Greek Megasthenes, ambassador of Seleucus Nicator at the court of Sandrakotos near Patna, who wrote an account of India 300 years before Christ, says that then the whole country was under irrigation and very prosperous because of the double harvests, which by its means the people were enabled to reap each year. There were reservoirs in Ceylon and in southern India more than 2000 years old. Quotation from Irrigated India, page 141. But even the most notable of these enterprises was marked by a paucity of idea and inadequacy of conception. In Tanjore and the adjoining district of Trichinopoli, the indigenous works had proved comparatively successful. They, however, only made use of the river during the rains when the water was least wanted. Our engineer's conception and intention was to preserve the flood waters for the dry season. He did it. The doing of it removed the rice crops from the danger of utter destruction. Rice being the staple article of food, what he did meant nothing less than rescue from starvation and misery for the whole population. Oh, sorry, friends, to interrupt. This is total misunderstanding on the part of the lady because the floodwaters were supposed to travel through the canals to tanks, and the tanks were the ones who supplied water for the rice fields in ancient India. So it's not exactly right to say that the canals directly irrigated the rice fields. It's actually the tanks which got filled during the rainy season and they supplied water to the rice fields in post rain season, that is after the rainy season. Goodness. There was a singular appropriateness in the time at which the Coleraune was taken in hand. Within 6 months from the date of sanction of the plans, enough had been done before the monsoon burst in what proved to be a dry season to make the works most potent. So much water was stored, even at this early date from commencement, that much distress was prevented, and the treasury, instead of being depleted, received additional revenue. Arthur Cotton had great expectations as to what his anecdotes would do. He thus expresses those ideas. First, an increased supply of water in Tanjore on 100 days, counting those only on which the supply was deficient, would be ensured, the quantity varying from nothing to 1500,000 cubic yards per hour or averaging 500,000 cubic yards per hour and amounting in all to 1200 millions or one-fifth of the total quantity that Tanjore received at present, which is on an average 6,000 millions. Second, it would entirely put an end to all disputes about the extension of the head of Seringam, etc. Third, it would free the Trichinopoli riots of Lal Gudi entirely and those of Seringam and part of Konad in some measure from the trouble and expense of making Corambos temporary dams and render the supply of water in their lands almost certain. Fourth, it would enable the people to use the early and partial freshes to a much greater extent than at present, make the crop more rapid in its growth, and by both the harvest would be earlier and consequently a more abundant supply would be left for the late lands. Fifth, it would greatly increase the effect of the undersluices, both by enabling us to open them oftener and also by giving a greater head of water. Hence, there will be a most complete control over the level of the bed of the Kaveri, which is very important. Again, he always considered and reminded those who consulted him on this subject that the value of irrigation works must be regarded as having two aspects. First, the additional revenue brought to the government by this method of employment of its public funds. Second, the consequent increase in the value of the land itself to the native community and the increase of their own incomes for which reason the land had a better saleable value. He added, the price of land will greatly increase. Once more, the increase in the value of property to individuals is at least proportionally great. He reckoned that the value of the independent crop would be augmented from its actual amount of £200,000 to £258,125, and that annual revenue from £75,000 to £103,125. With such results already assured, no wonder that Arthur Cotton's lifelong efforts were put forth to prove and to emphasize the fact that if a hundredth part of the time, labor, and money that had been lost by droughts or expended in trying to obviate the effects of scarcities had been expended in providing against them, very much might have been affected. Captain Cotton likewise explained that it was undoubted that in the worst year of drought that ever occurred, enough water had been allowed to flow into the sea, which, if used, would have irrigated 10 times as much grain as would have supplied the whole population. The Carnatic, I acknowledge, like England and every other country, is not able to support a large population if nothing is done to provide water, when naturally it would be deficient, and to carry it off when naturally it would be in excess. But I am fully assured that there is no reason whatever why it should not be one of the most populous and fertile countries in the world if the energies of its government were exerted as they must be to bring out the capabilities of the country. In this, he was at one with Burke, who, in a great speech on the Nawab of Arcot, spoke of the water resources of southern India as the national bank of the country. Again, he argued most strongly that the soil of these fertilized districts was by no means of especially good quality. Its prosperous condition was owing entirely to its regulated supplies of river water. His next project was a similar work with regard to the Palar, that is Palar River, with its necessary provision of channels and reservoirs. The Carnatic is not by the bounty of nature a fertile soil. It is refreshed by few or no living brooks or running streams, and it has rain only at a season. But its product of rice exacts the use of water subject to perpetual command. This is the national bank of the Carnatic, on which it must have a perpetual credit, or it perishes irretrievably. For that reason, in the happier times of India, a number almost incredible of reservoirs have been made in chosen places throughout the country. They are formed for the greater part of mounds of earth and stones, with sluices of solid masonry, the whole constructed with admirable skill and labor, and maintained at a mighty charge. In the territory contained in that map alone, I have been at the trouble of reckoning the reservoirs, and they mount to upwards of 1100 from the extent of 2 or 3 acres to 5 miles in circuit. From these reservoirs, currents are occasionally drawn over the fields, and these watercourses again call for a considerable expense to keep them properly secured, to keep them properly scoured and fully leveled. Taking the district in that map as a measure, there cannot be in the Carnatic and Tanjore fewer than 10,000 of these reservoirs of the larger and middling dimensions, to say nothing of those for domestic services and the uses of religious purification. These are not the enterprises of your power, nor in a style of magnificence suited to the taste of your minister. These are the monuments of real kings who were the fathers of their people, testators to a posterity which they embraced as their own. Quotation from Edmund Burke. Goodness, Edmund Burke seems to have said all this without actually having visited India. Uh, did actually Edmund Burke visit India? Let me check this for a while. Let's hold here at page 61, and let me check whether Edmund Burke actually Okay, guys, I'm sweating profusely, so I think I should go and come back. Till then, let the fan play.